Hey everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get our discussion started. My name is Haley Chang. I'm a female with short brown hair, glasses, brown eyes, and I am wearing a yellow jacket. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm an alumni of St. John's University. I'll be the intro person for today's panel. With that, I was born and raised in Hawaii. I grew up on the island of Oahu. I'm of Chinese and Native Hawaiian descent. Growing up, I noticed that many Hawaiians were overrepresented in prisons, overrepresented in high school dropout rates, overrepresented in our homeless community. And so a lot of the research I did while a part of the OSNM Scholars Program here at St. John's was centered around homelessness within the Native Hawaiian community. And in my research, I linked this ongoing cycle of poverty that many Hawaiians face to historic events in which colonizers uprooted and displaced many natives from their lands. So because of this, I've always had a strong interest in various outcomes related to racialized trauma. So with that being said, welcome to the third session of the Racial Justice Conversations, Becoming Agents of Change. Today's topic is the construct of racialized trauma. Every 2 weeks, there will be a different topic to enrich the knowledge and understanding about racial justice topics. And although the attendee list is hidden, we are happy to report that over 190 people have registered for today's session. And it was the purposeful intention of the committee to identify panelists, moderators, and openers who are diverse in identity and experience and whose lived experiences and or scholarship deem them experts, and those individual narratives can serve as windows and mirrors for our own. So today's panelists are brave, they're committed, and they are open to having these conversations and also leading them. So thank you for that. We hope you're able to review the recommended resources and that we can have an informed and fruitful conversation. Just a few housekeeping things. Everyone will be muted and no videos are enabled except for the moderator and the panelists. For the sake of time, we will not be reading presenter bios. Bios are located on the website along with photos of our panelists. All questions may be posted to the Q&A tab, and your questions we'll try our best to interweave your questions with the conversation as deemed appropriate. Conversation in the chat is highly encouraged to start a dialogue. We hope you can enjoy the public chat feature, knowing that the Q&A is going to be completely private. The discussion today will be recorded and it will be posted on the St. John's website. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to perform a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to the generations from around the world who have contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this movement. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we begin this effort to acknowledge that what has been buried by honoring the truth. St. John's University occupies the ancestral lands of the Matinacock, Rockaway, Lenape, and Canarsie peoples. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Please join us in giving voice to these truths at every opportunity. The committee will share a link in the chat if you would like to learn more about land acknowledgements. Because today's session is about trauma, which is sensitive and it's a personal subject, we want to be mindful that we are not looking for anyone to relive these traumatic experiences. If you need to speak with someone, we are sharing St. John's University counseling resources throughout the session. Students can contact the Center for Counseling and Consultation, where they offer virtual sessions this semester. And the link will be seen on your screen and available in the chat. Faculty, administrators, and staff can utilize the EAP through Human Resources. The EAP helpline and website information can be seen on your screen. So with that being said, our moderator for today's session is Dr. Elson Jacob. Dr. Jacob is an assistant professor in the College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. She has a clinical practice site at the Mount Sinai Hospital, where she also serves as the inpatient pharmacy faculty for the Mount Sinai Family Medicine Residency and Pharmacy Residency programs.
Thank you so much, Haley, for that introduction.
Thank you.
I'm Elson Jacob, and I'm an Indian American woman. I have brown skin, brown eyes, and curly black hair. Today, I'm wearing a black dress and a black and silver chain, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm so honored and happy to be here with you all today and to speak with all of our esteemed panelists. As I've been asked to limit introductions today, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event and our panelists and all of you who are attending. As an alumni of St. John's University and as a faculty, I'm just so delighted that our university is taking the lead in organizing these vital discussions. These conversations will really allow all of us to better understand racial justice issues and how each of us can serve as allies and, better yet, accomplices in this fight for justice. In this 150th anniversary of St. John's University, I can think of no better way to honor our mission to devote our intellectual and physical resources to search out the causes of social injustice and to encourage solutions that are adaptable, effective, and concrete. I do believe that participating in these racial justice conversations is an important step in becoming agents of change. Throughout this conversation, I want to encourage you all, as Haley mentioned, to use the Q&A function to participate in this conversation with us. I also encourage you to read through the resources that were provided on the website. There are really some excellent resources, and they can provide you with the background necessary to participate in these kinds of discussions. Thank you again for joining us in today's discussion, The Construct of Racialized Trauma. In the United States, many folks are just now waking up to the reality that Black folks and white folks have two different experiences in our country. In truth, there have been two realities since the colonization of the Americas. We still see the profound ramifications of slavery and Jim Crow. We as the BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, persons of color in our nation, still face racism on many levels, from the individual to structural racism. COVID-19 has demonstrated how Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by the disease, and how Asian communities have had to deal with overt racism on a daily basis. The horrific murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, amongst others, have for the first time revealed to some that racism is deeply entrenched within the fabric of our nation's institutions. Now, some experiences that BIPOC experience may not be as overt. What I mean by this is that folks may experience microaggressions and implicit bias. This can include statements like, "You don't sound like a Black person," or "You're really cute for a dark-skinned girl," or "Wow, you don't have an accent at all," or "Where are you really from?" The reality for BIPOC folks is that the daily blows of insidious racism and discrimination can affect all facets of life, including health. Racism can lead to trauma. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Resmaa Menakem, the acclaimed therapist who specializes in trauma, writes that trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It is a highly effective tool of safety and survival. Trauma is also not an event. It is the body's protective response to an event or series of events, and that it perceives as potentially dangerous. In the aftermath of a highly stressful or traumatic situation, we may have a reflexive trauma response in our bodies. Folks may also be triggered or recall an experience of trauma. The content of this discussion will engage the topic of racism and trauma that will be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with. We will be displaying resources at the university, and we want you all to utilize it as you need it. I think about my experiences growing up in Pennsylvania and attending a high school that was demographically made up of a majority of BIPOC students. In fact, it was over 90% students of color at my school. While some students at the school endearingly referred to the school as a castle on a hill, as it was located on a hill, imagine my surprise that out of town, the school is referred to as a dump on a hump. Why was this? In a city filled with diversity and beauty in many ways, it was considered by those outside of town to be nothing more than a wasteland. And although my school was made up of a vast majority of BIPOC students, like I mentioned, it was just the opposite when it came to advanced placement courses. In these classes, over 95% of the students were white. The remaining 5% or so was made up of pretty much my twin sister and I, who are Indian American, and we were the only Indian Americans in the school. The reason I bring this up is that oftentimes racism is embedded in policies that may seem innocuous. Racism, especially institutional or structural racism, is oftentimes hidden in plain sight under the premise of protocol and policy. As we continue to explore the impact of race and racism, we aim to look at how the ideas, practices, and policies that underpin policing, healthcare, education, finance, and other systems produce racialized trauma. Now we have a lot to discuss, and so I want us to get started. So first I want to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Natalie Byfield, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at St. John's University. Natalie, we talk about systemic racism in terms of policies and practices that center whiteness. Could you please speak about some of the ways in which you have seen and experienced policies enacted in such a way that they have been occasions of trauma?
I am thrilled to be here, and I want to just say that I am a dark-complexioned Black woman who has salt and pepper dreadlocks, and I'm wearing a gray dress and a black sweater, and I use the pronoun she and her. And I am really happy to be a part of the work that the university is doing, and think it's important that we continue these events and these conversations. So in the context of what you have raised here, over the course of my entire life, I have experienced systemic racism that makes it clear to me that the position I'm expected to occupy in the dominant culture, and I'm referring specifically to European or white, male, cisgendered culture, which treats Black women, particularly women from poor families, as less than fully human or as second or third class citizens. And I've witnessed over the course of my life policies, practices also, and sometimes laws that have reinforced this position that the dominant culture expects me to maintain, and it's a position of subordination. So in Jamaica, the country from which I originate, a lot of people use patois, which is a mixture of English and African words. In the school I attended, if you use patois, that merited a flogging with a cane. And that was the word they used, flogging, you know? And so how's that for forcing people to stay in line? And some of these practices and these types of responses to people just expressing themselves in the culture in which they're growing up started pointing out to me at a very early age just what was expected of me, and if those expectations were not met, what my position would be. And it also identified for me the level of powerlessness I was expected to accept. When I was a student here in the United States, I attended Princeton University. And one night as I was walking back to my dorm, I was hosed with a fire extinguisher by some white guys who were leaving a party at an eating club. I'm still waiting for campus police to come and take my statement. They said they were on their way, and that just never happened. But that gives an indication now of exactly what my position was in the context of that campus and how my sense of safety would be, my sense of safety or my lack of safety would be addressed in that environment. My sister attended Dartmouth College, and I went to visit her during the time she was there. And this is a different space, but another group of white guys driving down the street yelled at us the N word and the B word and told us to get off their campus. So I got the degrees I needed eventually. But as I entered the job market, my father was so concerned about me being able to be employed. I used to wear my hair in a short afro. He one day handed me this wad of cash and he said, "You've got to go and get your hair changed. No one is going to hire you." And I just said, we can't afford to be worried about that. But I have to point out that it wasn't until 2019 that in New York City, it was ruled a discriminatory act to act against, harass, or discriminate against Black people for the way they wear their hair. And so these are practices that have been going on through the course of my life that identify for me how I need to see my position in the context, the position that's been outlined for me in the context of the dominant culture. And what this has done and what this does to people is that it breeds fear, insecurity, and feelings of never being good enough that ultimately are traumatizing for the people who live through these. And the twisted part of being in this subordinated and relatively power-deprived position is that Black women are still being expected to do the bulk of the work to remedy these problems. And so these are some of the ways in which I thought on a personal level I could talk about the types of trauma that exist in the daily lives of Black, Indigenous people of color as we try to navigate life in the context of the dominant culture.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing those powerful personal stories. It is like really, really shocking when you talk about hair, for example, that it took these many years for there to even be something in the legislation, right? Like it's just so mind-blowing how entrenched it is in all aspects. Racism is entrenched in all aspects of daily life. So thank you so much for sharing those personal stories with us. Our next panelist, I would like to ask the same question, is Mr. Leonard Brayton, who's an Associate Director of Student Development and RISE Mentoring at St. John's University. Lenny, I would like you to also respond to the same question. Could you speak about some of the ways in which you have seen and experienced policies enacted in such a way that they have been affected by trauma?
Thank you, Allison. Again, my name is Leonard Brayton. I am a Black male with dark brown skin, a bald head, black beard with some sprinkling of salt in there. I'm wearing a red St. John's polo shirt. Handsome is a relative term, so I'll leave that out for today. And I use he, him, his affirming pronouns. But to me, racialized trauma is being a Black male educator and feeling the immense pressure to be informed, more informed than any person I'm speaking with at any time, particularly regarding race-related conversations, because I feel that it is my responsibility to not miss any opportunity that I can to convince a potential ally or detractor that racial trauma is real. Dr. Byfield mentioned this in her comments, talking about questioning oneself, and I find myself questioning my own ability on the job or being appointed to a committee because I wonder if I'm there because of my qualifications or if it is because of some new initiative that is supposed to increase diversity, well-intentioned or not. Having to keep a positive and affable demeanor when in public or in social settings because strangers might see me or perceive me in a way that I don't want them to. And we're going to talk about interaction with law enforcement and realizing that because of my size and because of my complexion that I may fit a description, and seeing some of the effects of people that look like me and what happens to them regardless of their backgrounds. not one to be in that particular category. So when we talk about trauma, I speak from a personal perspective regarding that, because the cumulative effects of racism on an individual is more than just mental, it's also physical. When we talk about what was happening throughout the pandemic, which was sparked by what happened in Minnesota, I envisioned my own name as a hashtag and wondered what it would be like if something happened to me and what folks would say about me after I'm gone. And when I share that with others, it seems to be jarring, but that seems to be the type of emotion that I want to evoke from those that do care about me, because there's something that's missing and there was a disconnect. And why did it take that much for people to recognize that policies do need to change and trauma is very real for people without having to validate that with statistics or information? We're able to trust someone with no political experience to lead our government at the highest position, but I need to be a doctor or a statistician to have you believe that what I feel is real. When we think about the shut up and dribble with athletes, when we think about athletes like Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali, they couldn't just be athletes during that time in their lives. They probably wanted to be, but they couldn't. But because they stepped out of their lane, they caused some long-lasting change in sports and in society, which made the way for the likes of Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, and others. So when I have a chance to speak on panels like this one, I ask that I am revered for who I am while I'm still here. Don't revere me when I'm gone, in the likes of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or others in that sense. What do we know about the relationship between discrimination and mental health or trauma? Without being a mental health specialist, I know enough to know that what I experience is traumatic and it has an impact on my formation, on my being, on myself. I am an expert in my own experience, and I don't need science or resources to validate those experiences to anybody. Fortunately, science still does support these feelings, and we have panelists here today that are going to speak to that much better than I can. It is no longer my responsibility to manage my emotions and compartmentalize my trauma so that others can hopefully understand me better. But that is also something that I face as a dilemma being an educator. If I don't teach you, who will? If I don't teach you, will you ever learn? For those that are here today, it is clear that you want to learn and you want to share. So my hope is that after these conversations, you challenge those around you, and hopefully you take something positive from today, and we can continue these dialogues and force these policy changes that do support people from all walks of life.
Thank you so much for that, Lenny. That, again, really powerful personal experiences that I think offer insight for those who may not have heard somebody who they know or someone from our university really speak about the way that you've experienced it. And and you don't have to do that, obviously. This is an obvious matter. Like, we all know that racism exists, but we really truly appreciate you sharing that, because I think it offers a lot of insight for those who may not have heard that from you before. So thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Brondolo, who is a professor in the Department of Physiology at St. John's University. Psychology at St. John's University. Liz, I would also ask you to respond to the same question, which is, could you speak in some of the ways in which you've seen and experienced policies enacted in such a way that they have been occasions of trauma?
I'm very, very happy to be here, and very thrilled with this panel and the topic. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology. I'm a white, older than middle-aged woman, and I'm wearing a green dress. And I use the she, her, and hers pronouns. And I'm going to talk less from a personal perspective and more a little bit about what the research says. And I'd like, in specific, to answer the question about policies that are enacted so that they have become occasions of trauma. I want to talk a little bit about racial residential segregation, which is the physical segregation of housing for different races, and that occurs in many areas. So, for example, it's where groups of people of the same race live together separated from groups of other people or people of other races or ethnicities. And people live in racially segregated areas for many reasons, but for Black Americans, these patterns of segregation are a function of both intentional institutional discrimination and cultural discrimination, among other causes. But institutional discrimination included housing policies and practices that were intended to restrict the ability of Black Americans to rent or buy homes in areas where whites lived. But this segregation is also a function of cultural discrimination, in which persistent cultural communication of negative stereotypes about Black Americans fostered prejudice and racial animus and made people averse to living in areas where minority families, and in particular Black families, lived. And this happened in many ways, but here's one example of how this worked. When individuals are moving homes, they often check the school quality in the area they're considering. And studies of these choices revealed that white families were using the percent of Black and Latino children in the school as a proxy for the quality of the school and consequently avoiding those communities. And when that happens, there's a rapid and persistent decline in the material and social resources that are available to Black individuals or whoever is living in these racially segregated areas. And here's one result of that. When white children from low-income families are much more likely to live in a middle-class area with more social and economic capital. So if you're a white child from a low-income family and your mother doesn't know something or have something, there's neighbors who can help. And in contrast, that's much less true for children from Black, Latino, and Native American families. So for low-income Black children, for example, about 40% of them live in an area where the majority of other families are impoverished. And similar findings are seen for Latinx and Native American families. So for the children of these families, there are fewer places to turn in the neighborhood. When your family is struggling, right, so is your neighbors. So there's fewer people to ask for advice, for support, for a cup of sugar. And it's hard to change this because racial segregation and interracial anxiety and prejudice mean that Black Americans living in segregated communities do not have as much access to the social networks necessary to move forward economically. And for those of you who are students, that's why going to college is critical and developing multiracial networks is critical. So here's how this is related to trauma. High poverty areas are more likely to be associated with higher violence rates. And as a consequence, Black and sometimes Latino people are more likely to experience violence, to witness or experience violent assaults or homicide. And violence exposure, even if you're a witness and not a direct victim, has an effect. So although whites overall are more likely to report being exposed to a traumatic event of some kind, Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are more likely to be exposed to trauma involving violence. And the structure and lack of resources in the neighborhood can increase trauma exposure and undermine the ability to recover, to develop the wide range of resources which are necessary to recover. So that's the pathway through which policies can affect trauma exposure for many people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for sharing that historical perspective. I appreciate it. Our next panelist is going to be Ms. Erica Flores, who is an ENL bilingual resource specialist and adjunct professor in the School of Education at St. John's University. Erica, I would like to ask you the same question, which is, could you speak in some of the ways in which you have seen and experienced policies enacted in such a way that they have been occasions of trauma?
Hi, everyone. I am a Latinx woman with light brown skin, long brown hair. I'm wearing a Black shirt, and my affirming pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so, like some of my co-panelists, Natalie and Lenny, I have both seen and experienced the negative effects of policies enacted in such a way that they have led to occasions of trauma. And so I do hope that by sharing my own story, it will help others understand and believe the narrative, because so many of us BIPOC are dealing with racial trauma, and unfortunately it can be overlooked. So in short, systemic racism that manifests itself in hiring practices and residential segregation and the wealth gap have centered whiteness in my lived experience, leading to interpersonal racism and my own racial trauma. So I grew up on Long Island, which is one of the most segregated suburbs in the country. And I think it's important to first recognize the intersectionality of my identity and my own privilege, especially that I attended private school for the majority of my educational career, both on Long Island and in Puerto Rico, where I was born. So the cultural capital I accrued is a privilege, as is my socioeconomic status, a privilege which further extended itself into my extracurricular activities, where my parents graciously enrolled me in competitive dance. So the financial systemic inequities, inequities that are very prominent in Black and Brown communities meant that there weren't many other students who looked like me at school or dance because of the hefty price tag that does come along with both. And so after several episodes of discrimination and frequent microaggressions, I was made acutely aware that I didn't fully belong. So whiteness has always been at the center of my educative experience and created a divide in my life and identity. And now I fast forward to my tenure as a teacher of English language learners on Long Island. I found myself advocating for their needs and rights and faced a lot of harsh pushback from other teachers, my colleagues, the people who were responsible for molding the minds of these diverse children. And there were comments about students needing to assimilate, teachers not wanting to change their style of teaching to accommodate those students, constant microaggressions, doors slammed in my face, silent treatment by others. I took on what felt like an entire staff and union in defense of children, but also in my own defense, as only one of the handful of people of color that were employed in said school and district. And as I continue my work advocating for our immigrant students in a very different capacity now, no longer a teacher of English language learners, but instead providing professional development and training for teachers, I'm constantly confronting the deficit view some educators still have of this subgroup and their families. And, these work experience have brought to light hiring practices in education where the teacher population does not reflect the student population, and continuing to center whiteness in educational spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing about your experiences, Erica. And, as I shared at the start of the introduction, I sort of, very much see what you're saying. Like the school that I attended was majority BIPOC students, but all of the teachers for the most part were white. And in the advanced placement classes, the students were also mostly white. So yeah, it's obviously a problem, and very thrilled for your perspective, both personal and professional. Thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Cecilia Pornther, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Administrative and Instructional Leadership in the School of Education at St. John's University. Cecilia, I'd also like you to respond to the same question. Could you speak in some of the ways in which you have seen and experienced policies enacted in such a way that they have been occasions of trauma?
I'm a Black, middle-aged, cishet woman with brown skin and brown eyes. Today I'm wearing a multicolored headscarf and black top, and I use the affirming pronouns she, her, and hers. Before I get started, I would really like to thank everyone, my co-panelists, our moderator and host, the organizers, and everyone in attendance today. It gives me hope and a lot of happiness to see that folks are willing to engage in really uncomfortable conversations and willing to stretch ourselves in this way. So thank you very much. I experience policies that are enacted in a way that are occasions of trauma, both in my personal life and as well as my research. Personally, I am a Black woman, I am a wife, I am a mother of 3 Black daughters, and living this every day in a society that describes my ethnicity as other than something that is normative is something that you grow into. right? It's like an uncomfortable pair of shoes if you don't have other shoes to wear. It doesn't feel great, but we figure out how to walk. And so you make adjustments. And as has been stated by my colleagues, over time, you make more and more and more adjustments. And the trauma is something that is longitudinal, right? This isn't something that was just a single event. It's biting your tongue when you aren't represented. It is being misunderstood. It is being the person who is responsible for presenting the diverse information and being that representative. And over time, that exhaustion, that anxiety of being in the space truly weighs on you, and it can perpetuate itself in unhealthy ways. I am new to New York City as of 3 years. I guess this is I'm in my 3rd year. And I thought, oh, of course, New York is, the most diverse place ever. And I'm in Queens. That's fantastic. Well, I've had to explain to my 2 oldest children that they couldn't go to a school that we had considered because their hairstyles are prohibited in that public school institution. We are very aware of the decisions that we make in searching for places to live for the very same things that we're all talking about. And one thing that I really want to also add is, given that we're all in positions of privilege, no matter our ethnicity, we're making choices that are complicit in some of these systemic decisions. And so when you decide to move out of certain neighborhoods or divest from certain communities, you're talking with your money, you're talking with where you spend your time and energy. And so having that constant conflict is something that weighs on me heavily. Seeing constant videos of individuals losing their lives, individuals being inundated with racist comments, and seeing this as a person who often embodies what that looks like physically and recognizes that the discourse around those things is at its core about my personhood, is something that I would absolutely share as traumatic. In my research, I research policies that are enacted to influence access and opportunity. And while I'm glad to say that we have certainly made strides, as we have increased access, as we have allowed students to see themselves and see opportunity on our campuses, where we fall short is our ability to make sure that they feel that they fit on those campuses. And it's because those campuses were not designed for them. Those campuses were not invested in with these students in mind much of the time. And so we're playing catch up in a system that takes a very long time to create change. When we think about what it means to have institutional or professional fit, what it means to have a professional mentor, a faculty mentor for undergraduates, we have these images in our heads and we're comfortable in that space. But what does that mean for our students who come from different traditions, who haven't had to experience a place where they haven't fit in this way? This is trauma that we certainly have to be concerned about, but more importantly, that we have to do our best to dismantle in protection and advocacy of our students. In education, our centering of white perspectives is standard and normative, both in quantitative research and in qualitative expectations, makes other perspectives, particularly of BIPOC students, something other than normal. And what does this mean when we continue research to explain phenomena? Traditions and research are valued and not valued based on these norms, things that we cite in our syllabus, that we state as facts, and that we test students on also abide by these policies and procedures. My perspective certainly center the truth and value of my lived experience, but as an education researcher, I am incredibly concerned with what this means for our future and whether or not we choose to honor the diversity that continues to increase and the complexity of that in our designs, in our expectations, and what constitutes student success from K through 20. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. A lot of what you said really, struck me hard. I felt like even considering the school that your daughters would attend, it's unbelievable that that's happening in this day and age. And then all of the daily sort of occurrences, like having to be a singular person speaking for your race or ethnicity, and then being that sole voice in a lot of settings where there's not a lot of folks represented. I mean, all of those that you said and all the examples that you shared really struck me, and I think really will allow people to see your perspective and all of our perspectives and how deeply entrenched, again, racism is in our society. So thank you so much. Our final panelist, our last but not least, is Professor Catherine Shaughnessy, who is an associate professor and open education librarian. Catherine, I would like you to also respond to the same question. Could you speak in some of the ways in which you have seen and experienced policies enacted in such a way that they have been occasions of trauma?
Hi, thank you, Elson. And again, thank you to the folks who helped put this together, the wonderful co-panelists, some of whom I got to meet, and I'm delighted to get to know better. I am a white, middle-aged, cis-het woman. I have short brown hair. I have green eyes, and today I'm wearing a blue dress with black sweater and blue and black scarf. And my affirming pronouns are she, her, and hers. So I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences. My presentation or my perspective is really more of a focus on librarianship, which is predominantly a white profession, and how access to information, both as a public good and in relationship to education, is often presented as neutral, but it is often centered on Christian, Anglo-Eurocentric resources. And as we've talked about, or as you've heard, when students engage in research, especially research that's personally or culturally relevant to them, if they don't find resources, or if the resources there are categorized as other, then as Natalie and Erica's experiences tell us, they're asking, it's basically automatically putting in a dominant culture expectation, and that a student who's doing the research is automatically in the subordinate position. And a library, which should be an environment that should be that safe space for exploration, reinforces that idea of powerlessness. And so, as Liz puts it, that place that they might turn for a social and economic capital, if they don't have it elsewhere, becomes another place of potential trauma and oppression. And just as a couple of examples, the Dewey catalog system, which every K through 12 and public library uses, was developed in such a way that the entire section of religions, 200 through 280 is about Christianity, and 290 is other, literally other religions. Languages, 400 through 480 are English and European, 490 is other languages. Arts and literature, similar thing. Anything that was not from US or European is categorized as other. And that is an opportunity for trauma when you are trying to, as a kid, find something and you are literally relegated to other. There are other examples, but as we move out of K through 12, in the higher ed arena, you have students who are told by their professors not to do research on a topic that they can't find a journal or a book on, when most of the journals and the books that we collect and that are valued in higher education are predominantly Anglo-European, and that our mentors of our graduate students, our students, and even of our new faculty are sometimes told not to pursue research streams because it's not a neutral enough research stream. It's going to be, you know, controversial, or there's, going back to the previous point, there's not enough research on it, and you're going to be this maverick, and everyone's going to, you know, automatically assume that what you're doing is marginal and non-important. So like from K through 12 and then high school and graduate school and in our professions, the way we collect information, the way we put forth scholarship, the way we distribute it, the way we value it, really has incredible potential for trauma or for development. And as an open librarian, I'm also now very aware that if we move towards open, we don't want to replicate those systems. We want to make sure that they are occasions for flourishing. So that's my perspective. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, even when we all think about our own educations growing up and what was considered a classic and what wasn't, and, you know, the required readings, I mean, it's really, you know, another example of how important it is to ensure that we're inclusive and every voice is considered equally. And so thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to move into the Q&A session of our discussion here. But before that, I wanted to say, you know, we've discussed many areas that are impacted by racism, including policing, education, poverty, and other educations include healthcare, economics, and psychosocialization. I would like to delve into these areas a bit further. So first, I wanted to ask Cecilia, if you could speak about how racialized trauma really contributes to an existential crisis for individuals of color and the communities and folks of color who live in them.
Absolutely. So trauma on its own is challenging, but when it's accompanied by racialization in particular, we're talking about someone's personhood, their attributes. And so the individual experiencing the trauma has to go through this process where they divorce themselves of the action, recognizing that they represent what is being discriminated against, right? And so decisions are made on how connected you feel to other people, other systems, other ways of knowing, and you're constantly having to go back and forth. So on a very small level, we've heard of code switching, right? And so where you speak one way, where you feel comfortable, Natalie used patois as an example, and then these systems and structures say that this is not normative, this is not acceptable, you have to behave in some other way. And so after that, we recognize that there's something about me, the way that I've grown up, what I feel comfortable with, that is not acceptable to society. So there's this disconnect. One of the things that happens based on my research and lived experience is that you then decide where am I most useful? Am I going to be able to move my agenda, my interests, my passions along being myself and authentically so? Or what do I have to change about, again, my personhood to be able to navigate a society that doesn't view me as normative? And then, of course, getting back to the existential is this sense of helplessness. Because what do you do if you embody the things that are not considered normative? There are only so many things you can change. We can change our language. We can change our hair. We can approach folks in ways so that we are seen as less threatening, or at least we try. But at the end of the day, we still embody that which is not considered normative. The other piece of this is that there is a role of historical racial trauma that permeates throughout families. It's the thing that makes you say, that makes me think, oh, how should I have worn my hair today? Is it okay to present myself in this way? That makes me think that the way that I interact with an individual might feel too aggressive. And what does that mean as a Black woman? And so these are things that are ingrained because I was brought up that you change certain things to make yourself seem more toward normative, right? And so repairing that trauma as you're trying to acclimate, it either comes at a loss to relationships, whether they're back home or within the community that you're a part of, or it strengthens relationships in this majority arena, yet you're still seen as other, right? And so there's this constant negotiation that we struggle with, that certainly is an existential crisis.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. That was also so helpful, just to kind of hear how, it's a daily sort of experience for BIPOC folks. Small decisions that other people might consider sort of like small, right? Like that does make a meaningful impact, and it's consuming. And so I really appreciate you sharing those stories too. I would also like Catherine to comment on this. So again, the question is, how does racialized trauma really contribute to an existential crisis for individuals of color and communities and folks who live within it?
So I'm going to move from libraries to galleries and museums just for a minute, and archives, because again, to the extent that folks from our communities of color are on the receiving end of or are the subjects of archives and museums, there is kind of a colonial attitude towards preservation. So someone from the dominant culture comes into a community where they say, oh, this is so beautiful, this is so important, and here it is just languishing, and fill in the community. It could be the indigenous community, it could be any exotic outside researcher coming in and saying, I'm going to take this back and bring it to the dominant culture. So that's one element of where communities are traumatized and become helpless because their community culture is co-opted. And the other thing, very briefly, is that once it's in the dominant narrative, it gets decontextualized, and so the power of an instrument that within the indigenous community really should only be shared within the indigenous community is now shared outside of that community and then described in ways that are from the perspective of the outside researcher. So just to reinforce the point that what we might consider to be neutral parties like galleries and art museums and neutral descriptions, the metadata of how to find these things or how to experience them also are problematic.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think that all of us have experienced that by going to museums and sort of seeing, those artifacts or other aspects that have been removed from cultures and brought over to museums in America or the UK and places. And there are still cases out there that those individuals who actually those aspects belong to have been fighting for that, and it's still not returned. So, thank you for sharing that perspective. I wanted to mention that we have a couple of polling questions for our audience members. At this time, we're going to share one of the poll questions. So we'd really like you to participate. However, this is voluntary. So we thought it would be helpful to hear from experiences and to give you a chance to share some of your perceptions, feelings, and thoughts. So that's why we're going to ask a couple of questions. These questions may evoke very deep, strong feelings, and we don't want to minimize the emotional impact of these experiences, but we wanted to find a way for folks to share a little bit if they wanted, so that we know that we're not all alone in this. But again, it's completely voluntary, and we're also including resources for you to access as you need. So this first question is, when you have had an experience being treated badly because of your race or ethnicity or other social status, what do you do with the feelings you have? And the options are: hold them in, share with someone and seek support, express my anger to the person who treated me badly, and calm down and talk it over. And here on the screen again, you can see the counseling resources that you can take use of and access as you need. All right, so I'm going to move into our second question here. As we know, historical policies have really led to inequity between Black and Brown students and other students. Furthermore, structures within our education system can devalue BIPOC students. I want to turn this over to Erica. Erica, could you speak about how policies and structures in our education system can negatively impact BIPOC students?
Sure. So the first systemic structure that comes to mind is the hidden curriculum. This can be defined as unstated norms or values and beliefs that are transmitted to students through formal content instruction, but also, the social relations of school life, which tend to replicate social structures and inequities in our society. So the hidden curriculum sends a message to our BIPOC students that their culture and inherent identity is not the norm and is of no value. So furthermore, the scope of racism is ignored in the traditional curriculum. There is a really heavy reliance on the beliefs of the past, mostly Eurocentric views leading to whitewashing history. This hidden curriculum can be altered and to be inclusive, but it requires a conscious decision by the teacher to implement a progressive educational approach. We live in a time where textbooks are recognized to be flawed, and the use of alternative or additional materials are necessary. And until recently, it was widely encouraged to include materials such as the 1619 Project, and other culturally responsive and sustaining resources that celebrate diversity and promote social justice. If we fail to do this, we're silencing the past, we're denying students of the opportunity to truly understand what has gone on before and recognize the value and contributions made by BIPOC. I also want to address policies that are in place that impact English language learners. So despite the years of documented research indicating that bilingual programs are the most equitable way to develop proficiency in English while simultaneously maintaining, sustaining the native language, bilingual programs are not always offered. Even when they are offered, there's this push to integrate the students into English-only classes, ultimately doing away with pieces of their culture and identity. And anytime we discuss language like this, and some of my previous panelists also described language in this way, but I consider the quote from Adrienne Rich, "This is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you." It's really powerful when you think of the many languages and dialects spoken by our Black and Brown students. Standard English, coming to be expected in all academic spaces, but language is such an integral part of culture and identity. For instance, what message are we sending to our Black students when we correct their use of Black vernacular? I just think that, we can create a space to celebrate all languages in education.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Erica. I would also like to turn this over to Cecilia. Could you also provide your insights into how policies and structures in our education system negatively impact BIPOC students?
Absolutely. So Erica gave such great information. I think I'm just going to really briefly add a couple of points. So first, there's a social capital element that comes with some of the policies, particularly around zoning and what we value in terms of school performance. We've seen parents punished for trying to choose the best schools for their children. We have seen really tough decisions being made so that children can go to a certain zoned school. It's very easy to say, well, I wish they could live in that district, or they're taking funds from certain students. But at the end of the day, we have individuals who are able to work in communities where they can't afford to sleep. They're seeing all of these opportunities. They're recognizing the social capital. And as parents, they're choosing to do the best that they can with what they have, which isn't much. We also recognize that there are many underperforming schools. And as individuals with means divest from certain communities, that takes a toll on the schools. In terms of policy, how we view parental engagement is largely looked at from a middle-class lens. And so what does it mean if a parent can't be present at certain events at certain times? And how have we structured that? What message are we giving to administrators and teachers around that? And then lastly, we politicize what's valued in education and training and research. The ideas of grit, resilience, growth mindset are all coming from that other, right? This is normative, and folks are scratching and climbing to achieve something different. that isn't expected because of their circumstances. And how do we shift that language? There is nothing wrong with valuing someone's strength and fortitude, but how do we further acknowledge that it's rooted in systemic inequities and policies that make it difficult for them to rise to the occasion?
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for those perspectives and very important information too. Thank you. So one thing I wanted to highlight is that there is police presence in schools, and research does suggest that this fuels the school to prison pipeline. And police presence in schools can be damaging, especially for BIPOC students and most especially for Black students. So this segues into our next question, and this is for Natalie. Recent events have demonstrated to the nation and the world that racism and police brutality remain a reality in the United States. We know that systemic racism and police brutality is not new, but rather a public health crisis that has been ongoing for 400 years. Yet in the age of technology, there is now video documentation of how systemic racism is enforced through police policies and systemic injustices. Could you please speak about policies or practices that contribute to the continuation of systemic racism and police brutality in the United States?
So, at the heart of this question is what policing work means in the context of the United States and in countries that have historical features like the US, features like a dominant European culture emerging from a settler colony. I bring this up because this genesis is central to understanding how policing works in the US today. In essence, policing began as a community-based project to protect European colonizers from the Native Americans whose land was stolen, and to protect European colonizers from the Africans who were kidnapped and brought here to rob them of their labor power for the building of the colony. And so these were the early priorities around which policing began in the US. In other words, policing has been historically a type of racialized and racializing surveillance that has become this normative practice, not just in the context of policing organizations, but also in the context of everybody else's life. Thus, as police forces developed across the nation, much of their work has been about surveilling Blackness, surveilling brownness, any other group that the dominant culture has otherized. And policing has operated in this way to make Blackness, brownness, the groups that have been otherized, to make those groups appear to be deviant. So even people who don't work in police, particularly whites who work in other areas of the society, or those with power in other areas of the society, they take on the work of surveillance. They become deputized in the process, and I'm going to make sure these people don't move into my neighborhood, and I'm going to make sure that this student operates in this way. So this logic in policing permeates the whole society. And if we fast forward to this period, we can look at stop and frisk and tie it directly into this and the way it's been used in the NYPD. So stop and frisk has been around since 1960. It's always been around, but it became legitimized in 1968 by a decision from the Supreme Court in a case called Terry v. Ohio that allowed police to not use the Fourth Amendment standard to detain people. And so basically what we have is a practice now that was systemized under the Giuliani administration and then expanded massively under the Bloomberg administration, to the point where over 5 million stops were made during the Bloomberg administration. 90% of the people, nearly 90%, were Black and brown. But what my research has made clear to me is that the thing we need to be paying attention to is how very mundane behaviors that everybody in the society engaged in were the behaviors that elicited stops. So when these mundane behaviors were performed or enacted by Black people, brown people, then it was criminalized. And what I'm talking about when I say mundane behaviors is what they call furtive movements. So if you're in a neighborhood and you're looking around, that's considered a furtive movement. That was the highest reason for a stop made in New York City on the stop and frisk during Bloomberg. If you changed the direction you were walking in and the police that was around noticed you changed directions, that could be a reason, like a legal reason to detain you. If you wore clothes that were out of season, that's a reason to detain you and stop you. And I think it's important to properly understand what such types of stop and frisk practices really meant. It operated not simply as an increase of police presence to so-called fight crime. It operated as a penetration into the very core of how each individual in those communities had to think about, it penetrated the smallest decision that you had to make about how you were going to move throughout your day. Imagine having to figure out how to get around the fact that every move you make, even the look on your face, could elicit a police action that could spin out of control and make you the next hashtag. So it's important to understand that one of the ways in which this type of state-based policing operates is that it's taken into all public institutions like the schools. And it's taken into private spaces like businesses, the places we work for. And it provides the foundation for how everyone treats, or I should say mistreats, Black and brown people.
Wow, Natalie, that was amazing. And that, I think it really hit me right here, like the level of, just what people consider normal, like mundane behaviors, walking around, looking. I mean, I'm just thinking about how many times, I'm not the greatest person at directions, right? So sometimes when I'm walking around, I get lost, and I know that even though I'm a person of color, I come from privilege because I'm not Black. So just thinking about those mundane decisions and how that can lead to then somebody being arrested, somebody being even killed. I mean, as we've seen on the news recently, and that's been happening. I mean, this is not a new thing. So thank you so much for going into that in such a powerful way. I really appreciate it. All right, so our next question is from Lenny. So finances play a major role in upward mobility, education, and housing. Lenny, could you speak on the impact that race plays a role in control or family financial situations?
Absolutely. My fellow panelists kind of throw me a lob over here. So Liz touched upon this in her opening remarks. Erica shared that she grew up with some of what I'm going to speak about, and even Cecilia mentioned living in a particular area due to school district. So when we talk about finances, it's hard for us to not talk about redlining, which was mentioned earlier before. This goes back to post-World War II era, and Black communities have still not recovered from that. It's sort of like a domino effect. When you think about once that first domino starts to roll, it's hard to stop that momentum. The Federal Housing Administration refused to insure mortgages in Black neighborhoods, so Black Americans became shut out from one of the most common avenues for accumulating wealth, and that is home ownership. Today, median Black families have 10 times less wealth than median white families. Systemic racism carries significant economic costs because it prevents people from making the most of their economic potential, particularly consumption and investment. Even today, there are still reports that make it necessary to hide one's identity when selling your home due to anti-Blackness. For example, being offered less when those that are looking to buy your home realize that a Black family or a Black person lives in that home, where people who are selling their homes now take down their pictures so that way no one knows who owns the actual house that's being sold. So chasing the American dream becomes that much harder depending on your racial identity as an American. Fortune 500 CEOs who earned approximately $14.5 million on average included just 4 Black people and 10 Latinx people, which is 3% of that total. Meanwhile, Black and Latinx people make up about 45% of the US working class, who would benefit from an increase in federal minimum wage to $15 per hour. So when we talk about how finances also impact healthcare, think about working class people who need to work in the middle of a pandemic because they have to make sure that there's still income coming into the household. When we talk about trying to accumulate wealth, it's hard to overcome some of the racism that exists in the credit industry. So when you think about people of color being receiving higher price loans or higher percentage loans than their non-Black or their white counterparts, even being more qualified. You talk about decades of trauma making people of color reluctant to deal with federal financial institutions. But ironically, because of that trauma and them protecting themselves from harm, they are distancing themselves from those institutions that they actually need in order to thrive. Just recently, a large bank CEO cited that their bank failed to reach its diversity goal because of a, quote, lack of qualified minority talent. That same bank paid out nearly $8 million to settle allegations in hiring discrimination, and a separate $10 million settlement for discrimination against minority borrowers. So when we think about how all of these kind of impact one another in a domino effect, it affects us right here at home too at St. John's University in the creation of the department that I work in right now in student development and RISE mentoring. We focus on Black and Latinx students primarily because they are the most at risk for not being retained or not graduating from college. So the program was implemented to kind of help combat that, because we tell all of our students that education is the key to getting to that next level. But now they have to overcome lack of information that they were told in high school, understanding what happens after graduation, and their loans, which are astronomical.
Thank you so much, Delaney. That really puts into perspective, just the levels that you have to go through in order to just kind of even be equal, right? Like, it's not even equity we're talking about, just to kind of be on the same level field. As a healthcare professional, as a pharmacist, I wanted to kind of share a couple of points from a healthcare perspective. So there was a recent survey in 2016, and this was a survey that was conducted with medical trainees. And what they found was that these trainees, these physicians, believed that Black people's skin was thicker than white people's skin, and that Black people's nerve endings were less sensitive than white people's nerve endings. And also, these again, educated folks thought that Black people's blood coagulates more quickly than white people's blood. So when you're thinking about it, these are folks who are treating patients on a routine basis, and that leads to a lot of decision making afterwards, right? So as we know, race is not a biological construct; it's a social construct, and yet these kind of this kind of training, or lack of training, I should say, then leads to further sort of a discrimination down the line. So, for example, when you're thinking about maternal mortality, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And then also when you're thinking about, there's so many other things. Black women are less likely than white women to get breast cancer, but 40% more likely to die from breast cancer. So there are so many aspects like this. Like when you're thinking about diagnostic criteria, there's a lot of race-based content in there, implying that it's a biological thing when it's not. So I guess like my point on that is, there is no racial difference between people when you're thinking about treatment. What it is that racism is a risk factor. Racism is the cause for these differences. So I just wanted to share that from a healthcare point of view. All right, so next I want to move on to Natalie. The next question is for Liz. So we've discussed how racism and discrimination does play a role in health. Liz, could you tell us what it is known about the relationships between racism, discrimination, and mental health and trauma? What are the psychobiological processes that might be able to explain how a social environmental experience of racism might affect mental health? And what is known about how to cope with discrimination, and why is it so hard to cope? I know it's a very loaded question. So Liz, this question's for you.
It's a very important topic. There's consistent research that discrimination is associated with depression across every population study, in children, adolescents, adults, and in pretty much every racial group in which it's been looked at. And depression is both painful and not good for your health. And similar effects are seen for anxiety. So how does discrimination contribute to mental health and physical health? This is really my primary research area and this is what the CHIRP lab works on. And we have argued that discrimination changes social cognition, the way we think and feel about others. And you've heard that in every story that people have told. Discrimination increases our anticipation of rejection, increases self-consciousness about our own behavior, not wanting to confirm negative stereotypes, and it increases wariness of others. So we have argued that discrimination changes social cognition schemas. And this is important because the effects of discrimination are embedded in these schemas, which are hypothesized to be neural networks linking thoughts, feelings, images, sensations. And that these neural networks, these schemas, trigger changes in the way we appraise events. They trigger changes in our motivation and our actions and our physiological responses to stress. So when we experience discrimination, it's not just a one-time thing. It activates all the schemas that we have built from our daily lives and experiences, our experiences of discrimination. And then it triggers a whole cascade of reactions, including changes to the way we think and feel about other people and our stress responses. And this physiological activation and stress responses also contribute to changes in health behavior. That's why quite a bit of research consistently associates discrimination with smoking and heavy drinking. But coping is difficult because it's an ongoing problem. Without validation, people can doubt themselves and feel isolated and angry and be unable to marshal their personal resources to address their concerns. And as we've seen recently, especially, but it's always been true, given the backlash against discussions about discrimination, it's not always completely clear that addressing these issues would help. I think that's why panels like this are so helpful. So sometimes people choose to deny or distract to avoid the pain. And in the short run, that can be helpful, but it's also isolating and undermining over the long haul. That's why the poll asks questions about what people do with their own experiences of anger or distress about discrimination. So for a long time, there was a lot of great concern, and I think it's still ongoing, that other people won't validate your perceptions or view it as too painful to validate your perceptions, even if you're from the same group. And I think one of the things that has happened this year is that the Black Lives Matter movement and I think the beginnings of the public embrace of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives means that there is an acknowledgement that discrimination exists and that people have been living in very different realities. So now different resolutions may be possible, different kinds of coping strategies may be possible when we share a common reality and recognize that discrimination is not right. So you asked what you can do. It can be helpful to recognize how discrimination changes the way you think and feel about others and your access to the larger world. And you have to plan and think about how you want to address those effects, to build a community of support if you can. And programs like this can help that. And most importantly, you want to focus on your own health, using meditation or mindfulness, eating right. Because when you take care of yourself, those activities are actually anti-racist acts, because it's against the effects of racism on you. So coping directly can be difficult because we're really only beginning to learn how to talk about these things with each other in a way where the consequences are directly addressing these issues aren't worse than not talking. So I'm really hopeful that we're beginning and that will lead in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for speaking about that and for talking us through that. It's very helpful.
Good.
So I wanted to speak about anti-Blackness and how anti-Blackness is a major problem in the United States. And while all persons of color are impacted by racism and discrimination, it is important to note that non-Black communities of color may play a role in propagating systemic racism through complicity. I wanted to turn to Erica for this one. Could you speak about how one can be both an oppressed person and an oppressor, and the importance of practicing anti-racism?
So I think a simple answer to the importance of practicing anti-racism is that if you're neutral in the racism struggle, you're allowing racial inequities to persevere. But to refer back to that notion of anti-Blackness in non-Black communities of color, I want to address the Latinx community to which I belong. So having experienced discrimination ourselves, Latinx, we are in a good place to understand and empathize with Black and, Afro-Black Latinx communities as dedicated allies. In fact, if you look back at our ancestry, we are a mix of indigenous people, the colonizers, and African slaves, so it really all plays a role in our genetic makeup. However, colorism is a huge problem within the Latinx community, further perpetuating racial hierarchies. So the belief that proximity to whiteness is valued and Blackness is frowned upon is exactly how the Latinx community is oppressed, but also an oppressor. And also, white passing Latinx can benefit from the privileges of whiteness, even if they don't identify as white. For example, although my sister and I have the same mother and father, I have light brown skin, dark features, but this contrasts greatly with my sister, who is fair with green eyes and blonde hair. And it would be much easier for her as a Latinx woman to exercise willful ignorance if she so chose to. Her experience being Latinx is very different from mine. I think it's important that the Latinx community specifically remember that there's a common oppressor and that we should be working together to defeat the idea of white supremacy.
Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing about that. I also wanted to share that as an Asian American, an Indian American person, it's the same within my community as well. There's lots of issues with colorism, where the darker you are, the less pretty you're considered in certain communities. Same thing with the way that folks are treated too. It's just embedded, and part of that is colonization, because India was also colonized. But even folks in the United States, it's still kind of the same thing, right? So I think that exactly what you said. It's in many different communities. We see anti-Blackness being played out, and it's really dependent on us as individuals to address it, to point it out, to call it out when we see it, even if it's within our own family members and people who we care about. If you hear it, you have to point it out, because otherwise you're then seen as what you said, you're complicit with racism, and that is just not okay. So thank you so much, Erica. So I wanted to go to an audience question. So Natalie, this question's for you. So the question is, in what ways have problems of institutional or systemic racism been deemed a personal problem for you to solve on your own that other non-BIPOC people have the power to remedy and address? So I can repeat it again. So in what ways have problems of institutional or systemic racism been deemed a personal problem for you to solve on your own that other non-BIPOC people have the power to remedy and address?
I mean, let's think about the structure of the tenure system. That's something that in the university, in the structure of universities, for example, but we could maybe apply this to other jobs. Let's say there is a process that people have to follow, and the process ends up being different for Black or Indigenous people of color because of the backgrounds that we have that don't give us the experience to be familiar with certain stages in the process. So if I were to be even more specific, for example, if someone comes from a family where the parents, let's say, work in white collar or professional environments or in the professoriate, in my case, it could make a difference in just your general understanding of what the process is that you have to follow. And the difference could be made by whites or people who have those types of privileges in their background is the institutionalization of measures that address the inequities in the system that we all have to go through. And so my mother essentially was a nurse's aide, and my dad was a garment worker. That they basically said, figure it out. And we have to figure it out. So unless there are structures of support then the inequities get reproduced because it's not these processes that you have to go through need to be demystified. And unless we actively work to demystify them, we're just reproducing the inequalities and then sort of rubbing our hands together and saying, I don't know why so many people of color can't seem to get through this process, when there's structural reasons why, or structural lack of structure that inhibits their progress.
Thank you, Natalie, for sharing that. That question was specifically for you, and I wanted to at least get to one of the audience questions. So we have received several questions, and I just wanted to say that, since we're kind of closing in on time here, I wanted to say thank you to the audience for all of your questions. We appreciate it, and we will appropriately respond, whether it be in a future session or in response to you. And now that we understand more about racialized trauma, thanks to all of our amazing panelists here, we hope that you take on the challenge of serving as allies and accomplices in fighting for racial justice. And I'm so thankful for all of the panelists and organizers, and for all of you for participating in this conversation. And I'd like to turn it over to Haley to conclude the session.
Thank you. To reiterate what you just said, thank you to Dr. Jacob, Mr. Brayton, Dr. Brondolo, Dr. Byfield, Ms. Flores, Dr. Hartner, and Professor Shaughnessy for leading this conversation. Thank you to all 135 attendees for joining us today. Just a reminder that it is our plan that unanswered questions will be gathered and addressed in future conversations. The video will be posted a week from today, and it can be rewatched and shared with others. The next topic is the construct of impact of power, privilege, and oppression in 2 weeks on Wednesday, October 7th at 1:50 p.m. Please take a few minutes to fill out the short event feedback survey. The survey will appear once you click to exit the session. And here you'll see a list of the counseling resources, series information, future session details, and the recordings can be found at stjohns.edu/racialjustice.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. And we look forward to continuing this discussion and serving together in this fight. So thank you all for also all of the panelists. I really appreciate speaking with you all. It's been really amazing getting to know each of you.